My mother called my hands filthy for carrying a tea tray, then signed the papers to disown me. She didn't realize those same hands were already holding the titles to every debt her crumbling empire owed. Before we dive into how I reclaimed my seat at the head of the table, please hit like and let me know in the comments where you are listening from today. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's listen to my story. Put that tray down before you embarrass us further, Clara. My mother's voice cut through the drawing room like a rusted blade, sharp and jagged with the cruelty she had spent decades perfecting. I stood perfectly still, the weight of the heavy silver tea tray steady in my grip, my spine as straight as the steel pillars of the sterling empire I had spent the last 15 years building in total secrecy. I was wearing the crisp navy blue uniform of a sterling customer service manager, a garment I chose to wear with pride to ensure the highest standards of care in my facilities. To me, this fabric represented the foundation of my success. To Beatrice Van Dorn, it was nothing more than a badge of public shame, a stain on her hand-painted silk wallpaper. I looked around the room, observing the usual suspects, the aging elite of Greenwich who clung to their pearls and pedigrees while their bank accounts quietly bled dry under the weight of their own vanity. They didn't see a woman who had mastered the intricate dance of international finance and healthcare. They saw a common laborer who dared to breathe their filtered air. I was simply assisting the staff, Mother, as the service was lagging and your guests were waiting, I said, my voice remaining a calm, deep pool that refused to ripple despite her storm. I chose the silence of the abyss, letting her insults hang in the air until they felt heavy and small. Beatrice let out a sharp, brittle laugh that echoed off the high ceilings as she turned to her friends with a performative sigh of calculated martyrdom. Assisting? You are a Van Dorn, Clara, not a scullery maid, though you certainly seem to have the soul of one, she sneered, her diamond-encrusted hand trembling slightly as she reached for her second gin and tonic of the afternoon, a telltale sign of the crushing financial stress I knew was eating them alive. I watched her, noting the desperation behind her carefully applied mascara, and I felt a flicker of an internal irony that she was mocking the very person who held the power to save her. Then came my father, Harrison, his footsteps heavy and authoritative on a Persian rug that I knew had been appraised for an emergency sale 3 times this month alone. He didn't look me in the eye. He never did when he was about to do something cowardly. Instead, he pulled a crisp white envelope from the pocket of his tailored blazer and dropped it onto the tea tray, right next to the porcelain cups and the fresh lemon wedges. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the silver was louder than a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the room. "We're done, Clara," he said, his tone curt and devoid of even a trace of parental warmth. "If you insist on living like a servant and dragging our name through the mud of the service industry, then you shall no longer be a part of this family or this house. That is a formal notice of disinheritance and a total severance of all family ties. We cannot have the Van Dorn name associated with your career choices any longer." I looked down at the envelope, my name written in his stiff, arrogant cursive, and I didn't feel the sting of tears. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized in that moment that their love had never been a sanctuary. It had always been a transaction, with rigid terms and conditions I had finally, thankfully, failed to meet. The indignation in the room was a physical weight, a collective judgment from people who had never worked a single day in their entitled lives. "Is this truly what you want, Father?" To throw away your only daughter for the sake of appearances? I asked quietly, my gaze shifting to my mother. Beatrice didn't even look up from her drink, her eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon as if I had already ceased to exist. "What we want is for the embarrassment to end, Clara," she said. "Take your tray, your uniform, and leave. Don't come back until you've learned that a Van Dorn leads, she doesn't serve." I didn't argue, I didn't beg, and I certainly didn't cry. I simply set the tray down on a nearby mahogany table with a that was remarkably final. I tucked the envelope into the pocket of my uniform, the very document that was supposed to destroy my future, and began my slow walk toward the grand foyer. As I passed the tall gilded mirrors in the hallway, I didn't see a rejected, penniless daughter. I saw the woman who held the secret keys to this city, the woman who owned the very debt that kept the lights flickering in this crumbling mausoleum. I stepped out onto the gravel driveway, the cool Connecticut air hitting my face like a benediction, washing away the scent of stale perfume and ancient lies. Behind me, the Van Dorn mansion stood tall and imposing, but through my eyes, I could see what they couldn't: the dry rot in the foundation and the hollow emptiness in the family vault. They thought they were cutting me off from a legendary fortune, completely unaware that they had just severed their only remaining lifeline to reality. I looked back one last time, feeling a profound, weary pity for people who valued a hollow title more than the living, breathing person standing right in front of them. The American dream was about building something meaningful from the ground up, and as I climbed into my car, I knew I had already won the only war that mattered. I gripped the steering wheel of my modest sedan, the silence of the cabin feeling like the first true inheritance I had ever received. The weight of the disinheritance envelope in my pocket didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a receipt for a debt finally paid in full. As I drove away from the wrought iron gates of the Van Dorn estate, my mind drifted back 15 years, to the moment the first crack appeared in their gilded world. While my sister, Meredith, was draped in designer silk and planning her debutante ball, I was tucked away in the back of a library, teaching myself the brutal mathematics of the healthcare industry. My parents saw my fascination with service as a character flaw, a bizarre mutation of the Van Dorn bloodline that they hoped I would eventually outgrow. They wanted me to marry a man with a prestigious surname and a portfolio managed by someone else. But I wanted something they couldn't understand. I wanted to be the one who managed the world. I remember the day I took the small, modest sum left to me by my grandmother, the only woman in our lineage who understood that a dollar earned was worth $10 inherited, and bought a failing community clinic on the edge of the city. To Harrison and Beatrice, it was a joke, a little hobby to keep me occupied until I came to my senses. But while they were hosting galas and donating money they didn't actually have to charities that only served their egos, I was in the trenches. I spent my nights learning how to balance a ledger, and my days learning how to look a patient in the eye and offer them dignity alongside their medicine. This was my life investment, a sacrifice of my youth and my social standing to build something that actually had a pulse. I didn't care about being served. I cared about the power that came from being the one who knew exactly how the machine worked from the inside out. As the years passed, that single clinic grew into the Sterling Health and Resort Group, a name that became synonymous with the highest tier of care in the country. I built it brick by brick, acquisition by acquisition, all while maintaining the invisible observer status that allowed me to see the truth of my industry. I chose to wear the manager's uniform because I knew that the moment you stop being willing to do the work, you lose the right to lead. My parents, meanwhile, were living in a house of cards. I watched from a distance as Harrison made one disastrous old money investment after another, refusing to admit that the world had changed. He clung to the American dream as a birthright rather than a goal to be earned, while I was living the reality of it through sheer, unyielding self-reliance. The red flags were everywhere if anyone had bothered to look. The way the gardeners were let go one by one, replaced by cheaper contractors who didn't know the roses. The way Beatrice started borrowing jewelry from Meredith's collection because her own pieces had been quietly moved to private auction houses. They were drowning in a sea of their own making, fueled by a refusal to admit that the Van Dorn name no longer carried the weight of a gold bar. I saw it all, and yet I said nothing. I let them believe I was just the unlucky daughter working a mid-level job, a quiet disappointment they could trot out whenever they needed a scapegoat for their frustrations. Back at the mansion, as the dust from my car settled, I knew Harrison would be retreating to his study to pour a drink and stare at the ledger he had been avoiding for months. He would finally open the drawer that held the statements for the family trust funds, the accounts that were supposed to provide for Meredith's lavish lifestyle and Beatrice's endless renovations for the next 50 years. His hands would shake as he realized that the numbers no longer added up, that the legendary fortune was nothing more than a series of zeros following a decimal point. He would look for someone to blame, never realizing that the daughter he had just discarded was the only person on this green earth who had the capital to keep his roof from caving in. The cracks in the sandcastle were finally widening, and the tide was coming in much faster than he ever imagined. While my father was likely staring at a wasteland of empty accounts back at the manor, my sister Meredith was busy polishing the brass on the Titanic. I pulled into the parking lot of the Sterling flagship resort, not as the owner, but as the woman in the navy blue polyester blend that my family found so repulsive. Before I could even step through the employee entrance, a sleek silver convertible screeched into the reserved spot right next to me, nearly clipping my door. Out stepped Meredith, draped in a cashmere trench coat that I happened to know cost $4,000, a coat she had purchased on a credit card that was currently 30 days past due. She didn't see me at first, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses as she checked her reflection in the car window, adjusting a smile that was as curated as a museum exhibit. "Clara? Good heavens! What are you doing lurking around here?" she asked, her voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that set my teeth on edge. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the embroidered Sterling logo on my lapel with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I heard about the unpleasantness this afternoon. Father told me he finally cut the cord. Honestly, darling, it's for the best. Maybe now you can find a job that doesn't involve whatever it is you do in that dreadful suit." I stood there, letting her words wash over me like gray rainwater, practicing the silence of the abyss that had become my greatest shield. I didn't tell her that I had just authorized a private audit of her personal LLC, nor did I mention that her perfect life was currently being held together by payday loans and prayer. "I'm just heading in for my shift, Meredith." "Some of us still believe in an honest day's work," I replied, my tone deliberately flat and unbothered. She let out a sharp, mocking titter, the kind of sound a woman makes when she thinks she's winning a game the other person hasn't even started playing yet. Work. Is that what you call it? You're a glorified janitor, Clara. You've spent your life cleaning up for strangers while I've been maintaining the prestige of our bloodline. The irony was almost too much to bear. She was standing in front of a building I built, in a parking lot I owned, insulting me for the very labor that provided the economic stability she was currently flushing down the toilet. I saw the subtle red flags that our parents ignored, the slight franticness in her movements, the way she clutched her designer handbag like a life raft. She was entangled in the law, a tangled web of fraudulent shell companies she'd set up to hide her shopping addiction from our father, and the walls were closing in. Prestige doesn't pay the mortgage, Meredith. But I suppose you'll find that out soon enough, I said, offering her a thin, cryptic smile that finally made her composure flicker. For a brief second, the golden child mask slipped, revealing a woman who was absolutely terrified of being ordinary. She opened her mouth to deliver another stinging barb about my lowly status, but her phone erupted with a frantic ringtone. She glanced at the screen, her face draining of what little color it had left. It was our mother. I have to take this. It's probably about the gala tonight, something you wouldn't understand, she snapped, though her hand was shaking as she swiped the screen. I watched her walk away, her high heels clicking aggressively against the asphalt, a beautiful, hollow shell of a human being. I felt a sudden, heavy wave of silent irony, knowing that she was walking into a storm she had no umbrella for. I turned toward the entrance, ready to lose myself in the professional rhythm of the hospital, but my own phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an emergency alert from the Sterling Cardiac Wing, less than 50 feet from where I stood. My heart skipped a beat as the notification flashed on the screen. Harrison Van Dorn had just been admitted after a massive heart attack. The timing was a cruel, poetic masterclass in chaos. The man who had just disowned his only lifeline had been rushed to the very temple of healing that his servant daughter had built from nothing. I didn't run toward the emergency wing as a panicked daughter. I walked toward it as the woman who had designed every square inch of its clinical flow. The automatic glass doors of the Sterling Cardiac Center slid open with a whisper of expensive precision, welcoming me into the heart of the empire I had built while my family was busy tearing their own apart. By the time I reached the VIP intensive care suite, the medical team had already stabilized him. I stood outside the door for a moment, adjusting my navy blue uniform, the fabric a stark contrast to the sterile, high-gloss white of the hallways. To the staff, I was just a dedicated manager doing a final quality check. To the man inside, I was the embarrassment he had discarded like yesterday's newspaper only hours before. I pushed the door open quietly. Harrison Van Dorn lay in the center of a room that cost $5,000 a day, hooked up to monitors I had personally vetted for their life-saving accuracy. He looked smaller than he had in the drawing room, his skin the color of old parchment, yet the arrogance remained etched into the deep lines around his mouth. When his eyes flickered open and landed on me, there was no relief, no fatherly recognition. Only a flash of immediate, reflexive irritation. He didn't see the woman whose capital was currently keeping his heart beating. He saw a servant who had dared to invade his sanctuary. "You," he wheezed, his voice thin but still carrying that jagged edge of unearned authority. He gestured weakly toward the bedside table where a stainless steel medication tray sat, holding the very life-saving concoction that had just saved him from a permanent silence. That tray, it smudged. There's a water ring on the wood. This is a Sterling facility, not some back alley clinic for the likes of you. Clean it up before it ruins the finish. It's filth. I looked at the tray, then back at him, feeling a wave of professional coldness settle over me like a winter fog. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer the comfort a daughter should. Instead, I moved with the clinical efficiency of a stranger, my hand steady and my expression unreadable. The wood is synthetic laminate designed for sanitation, Mr. Van Dorn, not an antique for you to fret over, I said, my voice as sharp and clean as a scalpel. I adjusted the drip rate on his IV line, ignoring the way his eyes narrowed at my lack of deference. You are here to survive, not to conduct a furniture inspection. He let out a dry, rattling cough that sounded like a curse. How dare you speak to me that way? Do you have any idea who I am? I am a Van Dorn. I expect white glove service, not backtalk from a girl who probably couldn't even spell the word luxury without a dictionary. I leaned in closer, checking his vitals on the digital display, my face inches from his. I could smell the stale scent of gin and old money clinging to him even now. I know exactly who you are, Harrison, I whispered, the use of his first name hitting him harder than any physical blow. And I know exactly what you're worth. In this building, you are just a patient in room 402. Nothing more, nothing less. The indignant rage that flushed his face was dangerous for his heart, but his pride wouldn't let him remain silent. He reached out to swat at my arm, a weak, pathetic gesture of a man who had lost his grip on the world but refused to let go of the steering wheel. I'll have you fired for this. I'll buy this entire hospital just to see you on the street where you belong. I almost laughed then, a quiet, internal sound of pure irony. The man was threatening to buy my kingdom with the very pennies I was currently deciding whether or not to let him keep. I felt no hatred, only a profound sense of justice. He was finally being treated exactly how he treated the world, as a commodity to be managed. The heavy door swung open again and Beatrice swept in, her heels clicking aggressively against the antimicrobial flooring. She didn't look at the man in the bed first. She looked at me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury when she saw my uniform in her husband's room. You! How did you get in here? Are you stalking us now, Clara? She hissed, stepping between me and Harrison as if I were a contagious disease. She turned to the intercom on the wall, her finger hovering over the call button with the dramatic flair of a fallen queen. I want the chairman of the Sterling Group in this room immediately, she shouted toward the nurse's station. I will not have my husband's recovery compromised by a disgruntled maid with a grudge. I want this woman's license revoked, her name blacklisted, and her presence removed from this building before I count to 10. I stood my ground, smoothing the front of my navy blue tunic, my silence acting as a mirror to her screeching hysteria. I looked at my mother, then at my father, seeing the two people who had spent my entire life telling me I was small, insignificant, and unworthy of their American dream. They were so blinded by the glare of their own vanity that they couldn't see the truth even when it was standing right in front of them, checking their pulse. Be careful what you wish for, Mother, I said. My voice barely above a whet, it cut through her tirade like a cold wind. The chairman is a very busy person. Are you quite sure you're ready for the meeting you're so loudly demanding? Beatrice's eyes flashed with a lethal combination of arrogance and desperation. Don't you dare speak for them. Leave, now, before I make sure you never work in this city again. I turned and walked toward the door, not because she ordered it, but because I had an empire to run and a family to dismantle. As the door clicked shut behind me, I could still hear her demands echoing in the hallway, completely unaware that the trap had already been set and she had just pulled the lever herself. I walked away from the sterile chaos of my father's room, my footsteps muffled by the high-grade carpeting of the administrative wing, a section of the hospital where the service staff my mother despised were rarely seen. I needed a moment of silence to process the sheer, blinding arrogance of a man who would rather die than admit his daughter was his superior. I reached the heavy oak door of the senior management office, a space that was technically mine, but remained anonymous to keep my invisible observer status intact. As I pushed the door open, I didn't find the empty sanctuary I expected. Instead, I found my sister, Meredith, hunched over my desk like a common thief. She had discarded her $4,000 cashmere coat on the floor, and her hands were frantically rummaging through a blue, leather-bound folder, the master acquisition strategy for the Van Dorn family's mounting debts. The golden child looked up, her face a mask of predatory panic that quickly smoothed into a sneer when she realized it was only me. She didn't drop the folder. Instead, she gripped it tighter, her knuckles white against the expensive leather. "I knew you were pathetic, Clara, but I didn't think you were a common criminal," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound leverage. "What are you doing with these? These are confidential Sterling Group files regarding our family's private holdings. You must have stolen them from the chairman's office while you were cleaning the floors." I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, watching her with the silence of the abyss, letting her own paranoia build the walls of her cage. I saw the subtle red flags I had noted earlier, the way she couldn't meet my eyes for more than a second, the frantic twitch in her jaw. She wasn't just protective of the family name. She was hunting for a way to save her own skin from the legal scandals I knew were about to break. "You've really stepped in it this time, little sister," Meredith continued, her voice gaining a sharp, manic edge as she realized the value of what she held. "If I take this to the hospital board, you'll be in a jumpsuit that matches your ugly uniform, but it'll have a Department of Corrections number on the back." She stepped toward me, attempting to use her height and her designer heels to intimidate me, a tactic that had worked when we were children, but felt laughable now. "But I'm a generous sister. I'll keep your little secret, for a price. $50,000 deposited into my private account by tomorrow morning, or I hand this folder to the security team downstairs." She actually thought she was winning. She thought she had caught a mouse, never realizing she was standing in the middle of a lion's den. The disappointment I felt was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the threat of our father's death would have brought out some shred of humanity in her, some spark of the American dream of shared struggle and loyalty. Instead, I saw only the predatory instinct of a woman who viewed everyone, even her own blood, as a rung on a ladder that was already rotting beneath her feet. This was the final straw that broke the last of my hesitation. I realized then that my family didn't need a savior. They needed a lesson in the very accountability they had spent their lives avoiding. I didn't argue with her, and I didn't explain the irony of a woman attempting to blackmail the owner of the very desk she was standing behind. "Is that all, Meredith? 50,000? I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion, a flat line that seemed to unnerve her more than a scream would have. She blinked, her bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "For now," she snapped, trying to regain her footing. "And don't think you can hide. I have photos of you in this office. You're finished, Clara. I simply nodded, stepped past her, and sat down in the high-backed leather chair that was far too expensive for a manager. I picked up my gold Mont Blanc pen and pulled a stack of documents from the drawer. The final foreclosure notices and debt recall orders for every Van Dorn asset, from the Greenwich mansion to the summer home in Maine. As Meredith watched me, her confusion slowly turning into a fresh wave of irritation, I signed each page with a sharp, decisive stroke. I wasn't doing this out of hatred, but for justice. The kind of justice that demanded a person reap exactly what they had sown. I was effectively turning off the life support for their fantasy world. "You should go back to the waiting room, Meredith," I said, not looking up as I stamped the final order for the bank to begin the immediate seizure of their accounts. "The next few hours are going to be very expensive for you, and I'd hate for you to miss the moment the bills finally come due." She let out a huff of indignant laughter and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled, completely unaware that she had just walked away from the only person who could have stopped the tsunami that was about to hit her life. I sat in the silence of my office, the weight of the pen still in my hand, and felt the final shift from daughter to predator. The Van Dorn era was over. The Sterling era had truly begun. The echo of the door slamming behind Meredith was still vibrating in the air when I picked up the sleek black handset of my desk phone. For 15 years, I had operated in the shadows, an invisible architect building a fortress while my family's ancestral home rotted from within. I dialed a number I knew by heart, the private line of Arthur Thorne, the Van Dorn family's lead counsel for over 30 years. He was a man of the silent generation, a pragmatist who valued cold, hard numbers over the hollow prestige of a fading surname. When he answered, his voice sounded weary, like a man who had spent too many hours trying to bridge the gap between a client's delusions and their bank balance. "Arthur," I said, my voice carrying the weight of the authority I had spent a decade refining. "It is time. Execute the consolidated debt recall for all Van Dorn holdings, effective immediately." There was a long silence on the other end. The kind of silence that occurs when a man realizes the world has shifted beneath his feet. "Understood, Miss Sterling," he replied, using my true name with a reverence he never showed my father. "The foreclosure notices are already in the hands of the process servers. They will be served at the hospital lobby in 10 minutes. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the hospital courtyard where the red flags of my family's downfall were finally coming to a head. I could see the silver convertible Meredith had parked so arrogantly earlier. A beautiful, expensive shell that was now legally mine. Below, in the main lobby, the scene unfolded exactly as I had scripted it. From my vantage point, I saw two men in nondescript gray suits approach my mother and sister as they sat in the VIP waiting area. I watched through the internal security feed on my tablet as Beatrice took the envelope with a look of confused indignation, her face quickly morphing into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she read the first page. Meredith, ever the golden child, tried to snatch the papers away, her mouth moving in what I knew was a frantic, high-pitched scream of, "Do you know who we are?" But the process servers didn't care about their name. They only cared about the receipts. The thousands of pages of unpaid debts, defaulted loans, and legal liabilities that I had quietly purchased over the last 24 months. The phone on my desk buzzed again, It was Arthur. They've received the notices, Clara. They are hysterical. Your mother is demanding to see the chairman of Sterling immediately to correct this clerical error. She still thinks this is a mistake, a misunderstanding among social equals. I felt a cold surge of intellectual satisfaction, a sense of ASMR for the brain, as the pieces of my long-term strategy finally locked into place. My family believed in the American dream as a birthright, something handed down like a tarnished silver spoon, while I had lived it as a battle for justice and self-reliance. They had spent their lives looking down on the people who served them, never realizing that the most powerful person in the room is often the one holding the tray. "Set the meeting, Arthur," I said, my voice as sharp as a diamond cutter. "Tell them the chairman will meet with them in the boardroom at the Sterling corporate headquarters at 9 tomorrow morning. Tell them it is their only chance to save the mansion." As I hung up, I felt a strange, heavy sense of the awakening. This wasn't about revenge in the petty emotional sense. It was about the aftermath of a lifetime of arrogance. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I was still wearing the navy blue manager's uniform, the polyester fabric a humble shield for the woman underneath. Tomorrow, I would shed this skin. I would step out of the role of the invisible observer and into the light of my own creation. I opened my private safe and pulled out the charcoal gray power suit I had ordered from a tailor in London 6 months ago, a garment that cost more than my father's car and carried more weight than his entire portfolio. I felt a profound silence of the abyss settling over me, a calm before the storm that would finally wash away the dry rot of the Van Dorn legacy. The meeting was set, the trap was laid, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, dangerously free. The night was long, but I didn't sleep. I spent the hours reviewing the final audit of Meredith's fraudulent LLCs and the foreclosure documents for the Greenwich estate. Every signature was a testament to my work ethic and their wastefulness. I was prepared to act as both judge and jury in the boardroom. I thought of my father, lying in his hospital bed just a few floors below, still believing he could buy and sell the world. He would wake up tomorrow to find that his world was no longer his to sell. As the sun began to crest over the skyline, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold, I changed my clothes. The transition was ASMR for the brain. The sound of the high-end wool rustling against my skin, a stark contrast to the crinkle of the navy blue uniform I folded neatly on the chair. I wasn't just going to a meeting. I was going to a showdown, a moment where the matriarch of a new empire would finally face the ghosts of the old one. The SUV was waiting downstairs to take me to the lion's den that I had built myself. I stood alone in the executive locker room of the Sterling Cardiac Center, the silence of the early morning feeling like a heavy, velvet curtain before the final act of a play. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a steady, clinical rhythm, a sound that usually brought me peace. But today it felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a long-awaited collision. I looked at the woman in the large, silver-rimmed mirror, staring at the manager in the navy blue polyester tunic. This uniform had been my camouflage and my classroom for 15 years, allowing me to be the invisible observer in my own empire, while my family treated me as a footnote in their own fading history. I reached up and slowly unpinned my name tag, the small piece of plastic clicking against the marble counter. It was the first step in a quiet transformation, a shedding of a skin that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. I began to unbutton the navy tunic, the sound of the small buttons sliding through the fabric providing a strange, rhythmic ASMR for the brain in the quiet room. I hung the uniform on a wooden hanger with a level of deep respect that my mother, Beatrice, would never be able to comprehend. To her, this fabric was a badge of lower-class status, but to me, it was the armor of a woman who had the courage to build a legacy from the ground up. I remembered the American dream that my grandmother had whispered about, that true power didn't come from being served, but from the self-reliance of knowing exactly how to serve others. I realized in that moment that serve was a choice I had made out of strength, not a weakness I had been forced into. I reached into the tall locker and pulled out the charcoal gray power suit I had kept hidden there for months. The wool was fine and cool to the touch, a suit of power meticulously tailored in New York to fit the woman I had truly become. As I slid the trousers on and buttoned the crisp white silk blouse, I felt a shift in my own internal gravity. This wasn't a revenge I was seeking. It was a resolution, a restoration of justice that had been delayed for far too long. I adjusted the cuffs of the blazer, the weight of the expensive fabric grounding me. Every movement was deliberate and professional, a preparation for the showdown that would finally strip away the masks of the Van Dorn family. I picked up the black leather briefcase from the bench, feeling the satisfying weight of the receipts inside, the hundreds of pages of debt recalls, foreclosure notices, and legal audits that would act as my financial weapon. These papers were the cold, hard evidence of 15 years of my family's wastefulness and my own work ethic. I didn't feel a sense of petty glee as I looked at the folder. I felt a profound relief. The aftermath of their arrogance was finally here, and I was the only person with the intellectual satisfaction of knowing exactly how it would end. I took one final look at the navy blue uniform hanging in the locker, a reminder of where I had started, and then I turned toward the door, leaving the invisible observer behind forever. I walked through the quiet service entrance of the hospital, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete, a sound of authority that replaced the soft padding of my nursing shoes. A black SUV with tinted windows waited in the shadows of the loading dock, its engine a low, predatory purr. The driver stepped out and held the door open without a word, recognizing the chairman even if my own parents could not. As I climbed into the back seat, the scent of expensive leather and cedar filled my senses, a stark contrast to the smell of antiseptic I had lived in for years. As we pulled away from the Sterling Cardiac Center and headed toward the towering glass and steel headquarters in the city center, I looked out the window at the morning fog lifting off the streets. The lion's den was waiting, but I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one who had built the cage. The tinted glass of the boardroom's private observation suite felt like a one-way mirror into a dying world. I stood in the shadows of the darkened annex, my charcoal gray blazer feeling like a second skin, watching through the silence of the abyss as my family occupied the center of my universe. They sat around the 24-seat mahogany table at the Sterling Group headquarters, a room designed to radiate absolute authority. Yet they treated it like a waiting room for a social club they still believed they owned. My mother, Beatrice, was currently lecturing my executive assistant on the proper temperature of Earl Grey tea, her voice carrying that sharp Greenwich edge that implied the girl was lucky to even be in her presence. Beside her, Harrison sat hunched but defiant, his face still pale from his hospital stay, but his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line of unearned superiority. He checked his vintage Patek Philippe every 30 seconds with an impatience that was as loud as a shout. "This is a gross lack of professional courtesy," he grumbled, loud enough for the staff to hear. "To keep the Van Dorn family waiting for over 20 minutes is an insult. This chairman clearly doesn't understand who he is dealing with." I watched them from my hidden vantage point, feeling a surge of intellectual satisfaction that was almost therapeutic. They were so wrapped in the armor of their own vanity that they couldn't feel the floor falling away beneath them. To them, their name was a universal pass, a golden ticket that would surely make this chairman overlook the millions of dollars in defaulted loans and legal liabilities they had accumulated. They didn't see the red flags that were practically screaming from the walls of this building. Across the table, Meredith was a study in frantic, high society panic. She was dabbing at her forehead with a silk handkerchief, her eyes darting toward the door every time she heard a footstep in the hall. She pulled a small silver compact from her designer bag and began dabbing at her face, frantically trying to hide the dark circles under her eyes with layers of expensive powder. She was terrified, but her only instinct was to paint over the cracks. I saw her hand tremble as she clicked the compact shut, her golden child mask barely holding together against the reality that her private shell companies were currently being dismantled by my legal team. The arrogance in the room was suffocating, a toxic cloud of entitlement that only intensified the longer they were made to wait. Beatrice began criticizing the art on the walls, calling it tasteless and corporate, completely unaware that the painting she was mocking had been a gift to me from a patient whose life we had saved at the cardiac center. I felt a cold, sharp silence of the abyss settling over me as I watched them treat my employees like servants and my success like an inconvenience. They truly believed that this meeting was a formality, that once they explained their temporary liquidity issues, the chairman would naturally extend their credit out of some misplaced respect for their lineage. They were in the lion's den, but they still thought they were the ones who owned the circus. This was the catharsis the audience had been waiting for, the moment where their wastefulness and cruelty would finally meet the brick wall of justice. I signaled to my assistant through the intercom, my voice a calm, steady hum in her earpiece. "Send me in," I said, the words feeling as heavy and final as a gavel. I stepped out of the observation suite and moved toward the main boardroom doors, the charcoal gray wool of my suit whispering with every confident stride. I wasn't the servant daughter they had thrown away yesterday. I was the matriarch of the only entity that could keep them from the street. Behind the double doors, I heard my mother's voice rise one last time in a demand for service. "Enough of this! Tell your chairman that Harrison Van Dorn is losing his patience." The double doors swung open with a slow, heavy precision, and my senior secretary stepped into the room, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "The chairman has arrived," she announced, her voice echoing off the glass and steel. I stepped into the light of the boardroom, my eyes locking onto my father's shocked expression, ready for the showdown that would finally end their reign of delusion. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed behind me with a sound as final as a prison bolt. I didn't look at them immediately. Instead, I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the skyline, a city built on the very work ethic and self-reliance my family had spent their lives mocking. I stood there for a long, deliberate minute, watching the morning traffic crawl like tiny ants below, feeling the silence of the abyss wrap around me like a shield. Behind me, the room was thick with a confused, indignant energy. I heard the sharp, frantic click of Beatrice's tongue against her teeth, a sound of pure shock and arrogance. "This is absurd," my mother's voice rang out, shrill and demanding. "Where is the chairman? And why is this person standing here staring at the sky? Young woman, turn around and tell your employer that Harrison Van Dorn is not a man to be toyed with." I turned slowly, the charcoal gray wool of my suit catching the light, and I watched the color drain from her face in a way that felt like ASMR for the brain. Beatrice's designer handbag slipped from her fingers, hitting the plush carpet with a dull thud that echoed the sudden, suffocating silence in the room. Harrison's mouth hung open, his hand clutching the edge of the mahogany table, as if the wood were the only thing keeping him from collapsing into a heap of old money dust. For a heartbeat, they simply stared, their minds frantically trying to bridge the gap between the servant they had discarded and the matriarch standing before them. "Clara?" Meredith gasped, her voice cracking like thin ice under a heavy boot. "What are you doing? Did you steal that suit? You need to leave before the security team puts you in handcuffs. You're going to ruin everything." I ignored her, moving with a slow reveal precision toward the head of the table, the seat that had remained empty until this very second. I sat down, my movements calm and authoritative, and placed the thick blue leather folder of receipts onto the polished surface. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Welcome to my office, Mother, Father," I said, the words falling like cold stones into a deep well. "I believe you requested a meeting with the chairman of the Sterling Group to discuss your temporary liquidity issues." The look of confusion on Harrison's face was quickly replaced by a desperate, clutching denial. "This is a joke," he wheezed, his eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting the real chairman to walk in and end this nightmare. "You're a customer service manager. You clean for a living. You couldn't possibly own this." "I don't just work here, Harrison," I replied, leaning forward and opening the folder to reveal the foreclosure notices for the Greenwich estate. "I am the founder. I am the owner. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am your only creditor." The catharsis in the room was palpable. A wave of that washed over me as I watched them finally realize the scale of their own wastefulness. Meredith began to stammer, her golden child mask shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces as she realized her fraudulent LLCs were laid bare on the table. "How could you do this to your own blood?" she hissed, the predatory instinct in her eyes turning into a pathetic, whimpering fear. I looked her directly in the eye, my gaze as a blade. "I didn't do this to you, Meredith. Your own arrogance and greed did. I am simply the one presenting the bill." The showdown had reached its peak, and the silence of the abyss returned to the room, but this time it belonged entirely to me. Beatrice began to cry, but they were the tears of a woman who had lost her American dream of status, not the tears of a mother who had lost her child.
You can't do this,
she sobbed into her silk handkerchief.
We're your family. You can't take our home.
I stood up, closing the folder with a click that signaled the end of the Van Dorn era. I looked at the sister who had tried to blackmail me and the parents who had treated my life as an embarrassment. I am not taking your home, Mother, I said, my voice quiet and cold. I am simply taking possession of my property. I don't just own this boardroom. I own the very roof over your heads and the beds you sleep in. And unlike you, I know exactly what every single brick is worth. I didn't let the silence linger. I had a schedule to keep and a family to dismantle. I slid a second, thinner folder across the table toward Meredith, the sound of the leather dragging across the mahogany echoing in the cavernous room. Her hands, still shaking, fumbled with the clasp as she opened it to find high-resolution screenshots from the security cameras in my office and a detailed audit of her Golden Sun limited liability company. You didn't just try to blackmail me, Meredith, I said, my voice as steady as a heart rate monitor, utilizing the expertise diction of a woman who knew every legal loophole she had tripped over. You committed corporate espionage and tax fraud involving 3 shell companies over the last 4 years. I watched the last of her golden child bravado evaporate into a cloud of pure, unadulterated fear. She looked at our father, but Harrison was staring at the table, his own American dream having turned into a ledger of red ink. I leaned back in the leather chair, the charcoal gray power suit I wore feeling like a judge's robe as I prepared to impose the new order. I have a deal for you, and it is the only one you will ever receive, I stated, the room falling into a silence of the abyss that I completely controlled. I will pay off the family's outstanding debts to the various banks and private lenders. I will even use my legal team to keep Meredith out of a federal prison for her financial indiscretions. Beatrice looked up, a spark of her old entitlement flickering in her eyes, but I extinguished it with a look before she could speak. In exchange, you will all sign these documents. You will formally renounce all future claims to the Sterling name and any remaining family assets. You will vacate the Greenwich estate by the end of the week. I pulled out a set of keys and dropped them on the table. They sounded like a sentence being passed. I have secured a 2-bedroom apartment in a modest part of the city. You will learn to live on a fixed income, and you will learn to labor for your own bread, just as I have done for 15 years. The total mental collapse of the Van Dorn name was finally visible in the way they slumped in their chairs. They looked at the keys as if they were made of lead, realizing that the servant they had spat on only 24 hours ago was now the only person standing between them and the cold, hard street. This wasn't a revenge of violence or screaming. It was a civilized justice, a catharsis built on the very financial structures and receipts they had used to exclude me for so long. Harrison reached for a pen, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely grip the gold barrel. He signed his name, the name that used to mean everything and now meant nothing, with a ragged, desperate stroke. Meredith followed, her tears smudging the ink on the very documents that stripped her of her status forever. Beatrice didn't reach for the pen immediately. Instead, she fell to her knees, her designer skirt bunching up on the carpet as she grabbed the edge of my desk in a display of pathetic desperation.
"Clara, please,"
she sobbed, her voice a wreckage of the polished tone she had used at the tea service.
"I'm so sorry. I'm your mother. I didn't mean those things. Please forgive us."
I looked down at her, not with hatred, but with a weary, professional pity. I saw a woman who didn't regret the years of cruelty, but only the loss of her velvet cage. I stood up, smoothing my blazer, and looked her directly in the eyes. I said, my voice a final, cold whisper, "You aren't sorry for hurting me, Mother. You're just sorry you lost." I walked toward the door, leaving them with their keys and their new, smaller reality, never looking back as I prepared to step into my own future. 1 month later, the morning sun spilled across the lobby of the Sterling Flagship Center, painting the polished floors in a warm, golden hue that felt like a benediction. I found myself standing before the same silver-rimmed mirror in the executive locker room, but the woman looking back was no longer an invisible observer hiding in the shadows. I reached for the navy blue uniform, the same polyester blend my mother had called downgraded, and pulled it on with a sense of pride that no designer silk could ever provide. Today, I wasn't wearing it as camouflage. I was wearing it as a statement. As I walked through the corridors, the staff nodded to me, their eyes filled with a new kind of respect. They knew I was the woman who owned the bricks and the mortar, the one who had signed their paychecks for years. But they also knew I was the woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty alongside them. I had heard from Arthur Thorne that my parents and Meredith were settling into their new, smaller reality. Harrison was reportedly spending his days at a modest desk job I had quietly arranged through a subsidiary, finally learning the true value of $1 earned through work ethic rather than inheritance. Beatrice was struggling to navigate the aisles of a regular grocery store, realizing that the American dream required a budget, not just a pedigree. I felt no hatred toward them anymore. I only felt a profound, weary pity. I had forgiven them for being small, but I would never forget the silence of the abyss they had forced me into. They were no longer the architects of my pain. They were simply people who had lost a game they never truly understood how to play. That afternoon, I officially signed the charter for the Sterling Legacy Fund, a foundation dedicated to providing scholarships and capital for self-reliance to service workers who had been discarded by their families or the system. I wanted to ensure that it was accessible to those who were willing to do the hard, invisible work of building a life from the ground up. It was my way of turning the aftermath of my family's collapse into a rebirth for others. I sat on the bench in the hospital's courtyard for a moment, listening to the fountain and feeling the cool breeze on my face. For the first time in 15 years, the weight in my chest was gone, replaced by a peace that felt like a permanent inheritance. I didn't need a mansion or a title to feel like a matriarch. I only needed the knowledge that I had built something that would outlast my own name. As I prepared to head back to the floor for my afternoon rounds, a small movement caught my eye. A young boy, perhaps 6 years old, was sitting in a wheelchair near the flower beds, his pale face lighting up as he watched a butterfly land on a nearby rose. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pure, uncomplicated curiosity. "Are you the lady who helps people get better?" he asked, his voice a tiny, hopeful chime. I knelt down beside him, ignoring the way the gravel pressed into the knees of my navy blue trousers. "I try to be," I said, reaching out to gently squeeze his hand. In that moment, as his small fingers curled around mine, I realized that I had finally found my true family. They weren't the people who shared my blood, but the people I chose to serve every single day. I stood up and walked back into the hospital, my heart full, knowing that while my hands might be dirty from the work, my soul had never been cleaner. Listening to Clara's journey always brings a tear to my eye. It's a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by how others treat us, but by the integrity we hold within ourselves. Clara didn't let her family's bitterness turn her heart cold. Instead, she used their rejection as fuel to build something magnificent. To my dear listeners, remember this: hard work is never a disgrace. Whether you are holding a CEO's pen or a server's tray, if you do it with excellence, you are royalty. Never let anyone make you feel less than because you choose to serve. In the end, those who know how to serve are the only ones truly fit to lead. How did the ending of Clara's story resonate with you? Was there a moment where you felt her strength in your own soul? I'd love to read your reflections in the comments below. What is one thing you've built for yourself that no one can ever take away? Share your story with us. Please like this video and subscribe to join our community of strong, resilient women. Until next time, stay brave and stay true to you.